Okay, so the cell cycle, what it is, it's a series of orderly events in the life of a dividing cell. Okay, so the cell cycle is made up of multiple parts. The first part that we have listed up there is mitosis. This is where the cell is going to divide, and that's going to involve the division of the nucleus into two identical cells. So, mitosis technically is going to be the nucleus dividing, and it'll be two identical cells. Okay? So we go from one cell to two cells, and those two cells are identical. Okay? The stages of mitosis, or the cell cycle really, is the first stage of the cell cycle is interphase. It's a preparation stage. It's the longest part of the cell cycle. Okay? And the cell is going to be in this stage the most of the time. Okay? So it's the majority of the time, and it is the longest phase of the cell cycle. That is interphase, preparation stage. So what kinds of things is the cell going to be doing during this stage? What's normal stuff you think that the cell is going to be doing during interphase? Somebody give me an example. What's a normal thing a cell has to do? I'm sorry? I thought I heard somebody say something. What's the cell got to do? So it's made, now what is it going to do? Okay, so it's got to carry out work for the cell. Okay, that's part of it. What else? What's the other thing our cells do in our body? All the time. Well, we're talking about replicating right now, but right now we're not replicating, we're in interphase. So we got to work, and then they also have to do what? All organisms do it. It's a part of life.
Reproduce.
We haven't gotten to reproduce yet. Okay. They have to grow. Ah, okay. Shh. All right. So during interphase is where cells grow, and it's where cells work. So a specific cell, it's got to make specific proteins, or it has to absorb a specific thing, like if it lives in our digestive tract. It's got to grow bigger, okay? Because a cell cannot just start dividing as soon as it's born, so to speak. Okay? It's got to grow so it can get big enough and make more cell parts so that when the cell divides, all the cells have all the little cell parts. Okay? Then we have mitosis, which is where the nucleus divides. Okay? And the chromosomes are duplicated. So here's where we get DNA replication happening. Okay? And then the chromosomes are distributed between the two new cells. Because when we have DNA replication happening, now we have two sets of DNA that have to be divided into two new cells. Okay? And then once the DNA is divided, because mitosis is division of the nucleus, then the cell itself will divide. And we get cell division, and that's called cytokinesis. Remember, cyto is a prefix that means cell. Okay? And then kinesis is movement. Okay? So the cytoplasm of the cell is going to divide in half here. And now we get two brand new cells. And these cells, are they different cells? What is mitosis? It's going to be two identical, right. These cells are going to be clones of each other. Okay, so stage breakdown. So here's interphase. We talked about, well, what possible things could happen during interphase. We have three sections of interphase. We have G1, we have S, and we have G2. So G, if you look at what happens during the G phase, we have the first growth stage, the organelles replicate, the cell will function normally, so it'll do a normal job. And at this point, it's determined if the cell will actually continue through the cell cycle or enter G0. And G0 means that it's suspended from dividing. Okay? So, based on what I just told you, what do you think the G stands for here on interphase 1, G1? Growth, right? So the G actually is abbreviated word for growth. So this means this is the first phase of growth. Okay? So first phase of growth here. So then it makes sense that when it says G0, that 0 means that there's no growth happening here. Okay? The cell is just continuing on and doing normal things, but it's not growing. Okay? So the cell will not keep going into cell division. It will stop. Most cells are going to live in this state and only proceed in the cell cycle if it's needed. So again, we need more cells because the organism is growing or because something needs to be repaired. Okay? So we're going through development and the organism is going from adolescent to adult. Okay? Or we're going through development and we get a cut or a scrape on our arm. Or some tissues are old and need to be replaced. Okay? So growth and repair. Then we have the S phase, which we talked about last class period. We have synthesis of DNA, or the making of DNA. So the S phase is synthesis of DNA. And then we go into G2, which is the second phase of growth. So we'll have more growth of the cell, and we'll have protein making. And what also happens in G2 is the cell is going to make microtubules and mitotic spindle. What these do is they help the cell divide. So now we're going to make more proteins that will help the cell divide into two new cells. Okay? Because the cell just doesn't do it on its own. There's something there to help. Okay? So inner phase is made up of G1, S, and G2. So if I were to ask you what phase of the cell cycle is the longest phase of the cell cycle, you would tell me inner phase. If I were to ask you where does the cell do most of its normal work, you would tell me inner phase. If I were to ask you where does most of the growth happen in the cell, you would tell me inner phase. Now I could go into more detail and I say, well, what part of inner phase is DNA made? Then you would tell me S phase. Okay? Well, what part of inner phase is normal cell functioning? You would tell me, well, that's G1. Okay? Or what happens to a cell that is not going to divide, then the cell will go into G0. Okay? So you need to understand that the G means growth, and that a cell in G0 is not growing, and that the S phase is when DNA is made. So a way to remember the stages of mitosis would be pass me a taco. They start with P-M-A-T. Okay? So the first phase is prophase. Prophase, you can see the chromosomes. Okay, so remember, DNA in the cell, when it's just hanging out in the cell, it is chromatin. Okay, remember that's loose DNA. So when it's time for the cell to go into prophase, this chromatin will actually condense, okay, or it'll coil together. It'll coil up, and then we get chromosomes. So chromatin looks kind of like this. Okay, it's still DNA and it's still very thick, but it's unwound. So this is chromatin. Then we go into prophase, and the chromatin tightens up and it becomes little chromosomes. And the chromosomes look kind of like this. Okay, there's one half of a chromosome. And then there's another half of a chromosome. Okay, so we get chromosomes, they become visible. Okay, they look like an X because the chromosomes are duplicated, they're copied. Okay, so there's 2 copies of each one. From your parents, you inherit 1 copy of each chromosome. And the chromosomes are actually single strands like this. Okay? Then DNA replication happens. We go through S phase, and we make a double up of the chromosome. Okay? Why do we need 2 of each chromosome? Because what's going to happen?
We get our trait.
But why do we need 2 copies of the chromosome? Why do we need 2 copies of the DNA?
Only one of them can be used.
It's always good to have a backup.
What is the cell about to do, guys? It's about to divide, right? So why do we need 2 copies of the DNA? 1 for each new cell. Okay? We need 1 copy of DNA for each new cell. Because remember, during mitosis, the cell goes from 1 cell and it splits into 2 cells. So each new cell needs its own copy of the DNA. Okay? Now, this is called a replicated chromosome. It's a doubled up chromosome. it's connected together in a place called the centromere. That's this little spot right here. Okay, so the centromere is where they connect together. And each of these is called a sister chromatid. So these two are sisters because they are identical to each other. Remember that the mitotic spindle are little stringy fibers that are going to help the cell divide. So that's going to form. The centrioles, if you remember from when we talked about cells, centrioles are only in animal cells. Okay? And they're going to help those mitotic spindles, those fibers, connect to the chromosomes. Okay? They're little bundles of tubes. They control the movement of cell division. And the nuclear membrane starts to break down. So a lot of stuff happens during prophase. We see the chromosomes. We see the protein fibers, the microtubules, the mitotic spindles. We see the centrioles. And the nucleus starts to break down. Okay? And it disappears. So a lot of stuff happens during prophase. Okay? And we will see little diagram pictures of this in just a little bit. Okay? First, I want to be clear about what happens during prophase. After prophase, the cell moves into metaphase. This is a bit simpler. The chromosomes line up in the middle of the cell. And those fibers, those protein fibers, attach to the chromosomes on both sides. During anaphase, the chromosomes split apart, and then we get one copy of each chromosome to the opposite end of the cell. And then during telophase, the nucleus starts to reform again. So we start to see that membrane come back. And then we get a thing called the cleavage furrow, which is where the plasma membrane will pinch in because cytokinesis is about to happen. And in plants don't have the cleavage furrow. What happens in plants is they make a cell plate. Okay? So pass me a taco. Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. Okay, so next we have cytokinesis. Okay? So that's the part where the cell will actually divide. Okay? And we have two new identical daughter cells formed. So cytokinesis, cyto means cell, kinesis means movement. The cell actually divides. And this is where the cell cycle will start over again. Okay? So now we have officially two new daughter cells. We have our chromosome number back to normal. Okay? The cell starts to go into what phase again? What's that first part of the cell cycle again? Cell growth. What is it? What is it? Interphase, right? Okay. Shh. So that normal cell growth, that's going to be interphase. Okay. The cell cycle that's listed up here, this is just like a little graphic to show you the stages of the cell cycle. Remember, you need to draw this. Okay. So interphase is going to be this whole section right here. So we start off with our two new daughter cells, and it encompasses all of this right here. Okay? So remember, interphase is going to be growth 1. Okay? It's a period of cell growth before the cell is actually copied. And if the cell does not need to go into cell division, it goes from G1 into what? G0, right? No growth. Okay? Then S phase is DNA replication. So that's what we talked about last class period. DNA replication. We copy the DNA. Okay? Then we have G2, which is where the DNA is replicated and the cell prepares for cell division. Okay? So that's all interphase. Normal cell activity, normal cell growth, DNA replication. Once the cell is ready to divide, it's big enough, it's got double the amount of DNA, then it will go into mitosis, which is nucleus being divided. Okay? So this is called mitosis because it's nuclear division. And remember, we learned pass me a taco. Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. And then cytokinesis is where the cell actually splits in half. and we get 2 new identical daughter cells. Okay, so interphase again, G1S, G2, mitosis, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and then we have cytokinesis, where the cell actually divides in half. Okay, so now let's look at our phases in a drawing. Okay, now the first phase, remember, is interphase. It includes G1S, G2. This is what the cell looks like. Okay, so this is normal cell. So if you are shown a picture of a normal cell and they ask you what phase is this cell in, and it's just a normal looking cell, you are going to say what?
Interphase.
Interphase. Okay. Now, when we go into prophase, remember, a lot of things happen. The nucleus starts to break apart. So that's what these little hash marks are, is that's the nucleus breaking apart. Okay? The chromatin starts to condense and it turns into chromosomes. Okay? So that's what these little X's are. These little X's right here are going to be your chromosomes. Okay? So that's those are the major things that happen during prophase. And then the next phase is metaphase. Meta means middle. So your chromosomes are going to line up in the middle of the cell because they're getting ready to split in half. Okay? You see the spindle fibers attached to each chromosome at the centromere. Remember that the centromere is the very middle part where they connect to each other. Okay? That's what the little red dot is. It's hard to see, but I just put it up there. Okay? Then, once the chromosomes are lined up and in place, the cell will start to pull the chromosomes apart, and that's going to be anaphase. So you can see one half of the chromosome goes one way here, and the other half of the chromosome goes the other way. Okay? And that happens to all the chromosomes. The little protein fibers, they start to get shorter and shorter, so they are literally being pulled apart. That's anaphase. And then finally, once the cell has the chromosomes on the opposite sides, the nucleus starts to reform again. You can see that right here. Okay? And the chromosomes will start to uncoil from each other. And then finally, we get cytokinesis, which is where our cells split in half. Okay? And then our 2 new cells go back into what stage? Interphase. Thank you. So from cytokinesis, they go right back into interphase. Normal cell growth, normal cell activity. We have 2 cells. And remember, please remember that these cells are identical. Okay? They are clones of each other. Exactly the same. That's what mitosis is for, to make 2 brand new cells that are identical. These are the details that we have to understand about the cell cycle. So first of all, the purpose of the cell cycle. Y'all need to remember that the cell cycle is for growth. Okay? This is how we go from a baby to an adult, is through the cell cycle. Okay? Through mitosis. Now, a baby will have less cells, and a grown person will have more cells. That's why there are size differences. Okay? So no, it's not because the baby has cute little baby cells. No. Okay? It's because the grown person has more cells than the baby does. That is what makes us larger. That's what makes us more developed, is we have more cells. Okay? So please remember that. It's not about the size of the cell, it's the number of cells.
What about when we get old?
Well, when you get old, what happens is your cells don't repair as fast as they used to. So your cells age, your skin isn't as elastic and as nice anymore because you have older cells and they don't replace as quickly. Okay?
Oh, so it really is.
Yes, Patrick.
I was going to ask, and then you start dying when the cells start dying, right?
Well, no, it has to do with the fact that it depends. There are lots of reasons why people die, right? Okay. There are different things like cancers. Some people die from old age, okay? Your body cannot keep up with repairing itself as fast as your cells are getting damaged. Okay? So that's what causes death, because eventually your cells can't keep up with keeping your body alive anymore. Because they just are so old and worn out, and they're not being replaced as fast as they can be. That's what happens. Okay? Yes, what was your question?
What about if there was a lower person, like somebody who's adult but has like smaller bones? You know what I mean?
Okay, if you're talking about something like dwarfism or something like that, okay. They don't develop normally. People who have disorders that make them smaller than other people don't develop normally. So there's something wrong in their genes that causes them not to produce as many bone cells as they're supposed to. Does that make sense? Or as many muscle cells as they're supposed to. So they never get to the point where they can actually grow into average size. Okay, so next we have repair. Okay? So our cells also need to repair. Okay? If we have damaged cells, and this happens a lot where we have damaged cells, okay, our bodies will make more cells to replace those damaged cells. So we get a cut or a scrape, our bodies go through mitosis, and then that's why we heal. Okay? Or there's damaged tissue somewhere in your body for some reason. Your body recognizes, oop, these cells aren't good, let's get rid of them, and we make more cells. Okay? And then also reproduction. This is a different type of cell division, though, and we will talk about it second semester, and that is meiosis, and that has to do with reproduction and making babies. Okay? So we'll talk about that second semester. But right now, please remember mitosis. The purpose of mitosis is growth and repair. Okay? During mitosis, your body has several places where it will make sure the cell is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. Okay? That's called a checkpoint. Checkpoints evaluate what's going on in the cell and make sure that the cell can actually go to the next point. Okay? So we have evaluation and inspection points in the cell cycle. They check for errors or abnormalities. If something is wrong, cell division will stop. Okay? And if something is wrong that cannot be fixed, then the cell will have something called apoptosis, programmed cell death, where it will commit cell suicide. Okay? So if the cell recognizes that something is wrong and it cannot be fixed, the cell will say, this is bad for the body, we're going to go away. And the cell will actually digest itself so that it dies. It releases digestive enzymes, and it will digest the cell. Yep. Next. Also, another thing that is good and good for us because our cells do apoptosis is it helps prevent cancer and other diseases. Cancer is a disease that is caused by an abnormal cell cycle. Okay? So our body is actually really, really good at recognizing when the cells aren't doing what they're supposed to and getting rid of them. Our bodies have cancerous cells all the time, but our bodies are able to figure out that there's something wrong with them, and they kill them before they cause any harm. Okay? And then also, a lot of times, what leads to cancer is the fact that your checkpoints aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that can happen because it's a genetic basis or because you're exposed to something that causes cancer and it changes how your cells regulate. And that's our next subheading, cancer, which is uncontrolled growth of cells. Okay? Basically, cancer is a disorder of cell division. So our cells aren't dividing properly, and it leads to cancer, which is an overgrowth of cells. The cells don't stop dividing. Eventually you get too many cells, and it leads to tumors. Okay? And the body does not respond to normal checkpoints like they're supposed to. The types of cancer. There are benign cancers, which is where there's a growth of cells, but it does not metastasize, meaning that they don't move location. So the cancer cells grow in one place and they stay in that one place and they don't move around the body. Okay? If you have a benign tumor, that's the kind of tumor if you have a tumor that you want to have. Because it's not going to move. It's going to stay in the same place. It can be removed easily. Malignant cells, though, are bad because malignant cells are actually able to leave the tumor, go into your bloodstream, and go to other parts of the body. Okay? And that's called the metastasis. They invade other tissues of the body, so they spread. And so that's why malignant tumors are bad, because they can spread to other parts of the body. Okay? Other things that cause cancer besides genetics can be environmental factors that cause genetic mutations in your body. Okay? They can lead to cancer or other diseases. Examples here are like UV radiation, tobacco, stuff like that. Okay? So they could possibly lead to cancer and other mutations in your body. And there are also some chemicals like that people maybe worked with a long time ago, or like the lady who, Madame Curie, she was a very important scientist, and she actually died from cancer, and she worked with UV radiation, but they didn't know back in her time that it caused cancer. So, in like her 30s, I think it was in her 30s, she actually died from cancer. Cell differentiation. Okay, so basically, cell differentiation is specialized cells in multi-cell organisms, so in us, that do different things. Okay, so because they do these different things, they don't look the same. They look a little different. Okay, so all cells do not have the same structure because they don't have the same job. Structure and function. The way it looks is very closely tied into what it does. It can be these cells can usually be distinguished by their size and shape. So doctors or people who are like pathologists can look at cells and be like, oh, that's a liver cell. Oh, that's this kind of cell, or that's kind of cell, because they can look at it and tell what it is. Like heart tissue or nerve cells. They still have, all cells though, and this is super, 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 super important, still have the same genetic information. All cells have the same DNA. They just don't use all of the DNA at the same time. Okay? So all cells still have the same DNA.